We're in a new month. Let me bring forward Dave Bertelson to introduce today's speaker.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
You can position wherever you like.
Yeah. I was really excited about this speaker because I met John at a debate between David and talking about libertarian. I used to be a card-carrying libertarian until I joined the Republican Party, and I'm hoping all libertarians join the Republican Party and vote against the Democrats. But I follow John on Facebook, you know, and he's been sort of open about the fact that he thinks drugs should be legal. And so I thought, well, let's let him come and explain his point of view. I have a sordid past of my own, so it's not you know, it's like, well, let's see what he has to say. So I give you John, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
All right.
Anywhere you want, anywhere that's
Where do we move that camera down?
Okay, I'll do camera down here. Okay.
Yeah, move the camera.
To be able to see my notes here. All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for having me, and thank David for inviting me here. And you know, when he first asked me to do this, I asked him if I should talk about just legalizing marijuana or if I should talk about legalizing all drugs. And he said, well, if you're going to be here, you know, might as well go whole hog. And you know, I like a challenge, so I decided to go. Let's you know, what the hell? Let's do this. And I bet though that this will actually be a less hostile crowd than when I went to speak to some Democrats a few months ago about school choice. I think about half that crowd actually showed up just to yell at me. So you know, this is anything short of that, and I'll consider this a success. So the main points I want to make are that the war on drugs is massively expensive, both in monetary and human costs. It has allowed the government to expand at both the federal, state, and local levels. Yet it also does very little to actually discourage drug use, and in fact it makes drugs and drug use more dangerous. And so if our goal is to keep people from harming themselves through drug use, the drug war is actually counterproductive in that. It actually causes more harm to people than it helps. And I believe that legalization is the only policy that actually corrects for all of these problems. Now, the monetary costs are relatively straightforward. Harvard economist Jeffrey Myron, who actually the Show Me Institute brought in to speak last year on Obamanomics, slightly different subject, but he writes a lot on drug policy, and in a Cato Institute study that he did, he estimated that legalizing drugs would save $41.3 billion annually, and that's $25.7 billion at the state and local level, and $15.6 billion at the federal level. Now, if those drugs were then taxed at a similar rate to alcohol and tobacco, you could raise $46.7 billion annually. If you total that up, that is about $300 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. The exact figure is $285.71. Now, just ask yourself if you know, the drug war. If you would pay personally, would you pay $300 for what you're getting out of the drug war right now? And in fact, for it to be a fair transaction, you would have to compensate all the people who are actually negatively impacted by the drug war. So it would have to be, you would have to pay maybe $600–700 to actually make this work in a market transaction. So is it worth that much to you to get the results that we get? And I'm going to present you some results, and I think you should conclude that the answer is no. Now, the primary human cost of the drug war comes in the fact of how many people we imprison in this country. We like to think of this as the land of the free, but we actually incarcerate more people per capita than any other country in the world. According to official statistics, we actually incarcerate more people, period, than any other country in the world, but most people are pretty sure that China is lying about the number of people they incarcerate. They probably incarcerate more like 3 or 4 million, but they just lie, which is not terribly surprising. But nonetheless, we have a huge incarceration rate in this country. And in a column for Reason Magazine, which just did a special issue, I highly recommend everyone go out and pick it up. It's on criminal injustice. This was their July issue. And Veronique Derougy, who is a fellow at the Mercatus Center and also writes a lot for National Review, She lays out a lot of the numbers in the prison system in her article in this magazine. At the end of 2009, there were 2,284,913 Americans incarcerated. And according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, there are 7,225,800 under some kind of judicial supervision. So that means probation, parole, and incarceration. Now, that's more than 1 out of every 43 Americans. So that's higher than 2% of the total population. That's a pretty massive number of people that we have in our justice system. And all these people, remember, it costs money to keep all these people either incarcerated or under supervision. Now, that equals out to a rate of 743 Americans per 100,000. Now, if we compare this internationally, we're basically over twice what any comparable country has. It's 325 in Israel, and they have, a population that in many cases would like to destroy their country living within it, and 154 in England and Wales, and 71 in Denmark. So Denmark has 1/10 of the prison population rate that we have in this country. Now, a quarter of those in prison are there strictly for non-violent drug offenses. So they didn't go out and rob anybody. They didn't do any direct harm to anyone. They're there strictly for either the possession or sale of drugs. And that's a quarter of the prison population right there. And now you have to take into account that a lot of the other people are going to be in prison for crimes that, if the drugs were legal, probably wouldn't exist. So, if drugs were legal, you wouldn't have gangs running around and killing each other over drug territory, because that wouldn't be necessary without the black markets. During Prohibition, we had, Al Capone and other gangsters running around shooting up Chicago so that they could get the territory. Anheuser-Busch and Miller, however, to my knowledge, are not bombing Milwaukee and St. Louis, at least not recently. I have not seen that. Now, according to a Pew Center study, there has been a large drop in crime over the last few decades. According to a Pew Center study, though, that is largely not attributable to the increase in the prison population. They say that only 25% of that is attributable to the increase in the prison population, and that's mostly the violent offenders that we're locking up. So that is not related to most of these non-violent offenders that we're locking up through the drug war. Now, once imprisoned, these people, life does not get better for these people. If you've gone to prison, then you're much less likely to be employed afterwards. If you are employed, your wages are lower than they would have been otherwise. And you're also very likely to, your chances of recidivism, that is, your chances of returning to prison, are very high. I believe it's about 40% of prisoners will return to prison within 4 years of their release. So putting people who are non-violent drug offenders into prison is only deepens the problem and induces them into more criminal activity. So this seems to be the incorrect route to take. Also, 1 out of 28 children now has a parent who is inside of prison. In 1986, that number was 1 out of 125. So, if you're concerned about the destruction of the American family, well, this is one place to look. 1 out of 28. So that's about 4% of all children have a parent in prison. That's not going to be good for the marriage, if there is a marriage. That's not going to be good for any measure of that child's performance going down the road, whether it's high school graduation, whether he goes on to go to prison. All those are substantially negative for anyone who has a parent in prison. So this is something to be concerned about. And the best way to stop mass incarceration is to end the drug war. Finally, and this is probably the worst aspect of this, at least on any sort of emotional level, is that essentially America's prisons are rape rooms, for lack of a better term. We celebrated the fall of Saddam Hussein and said we shut down the rape rooms of Iraq, but in America that's very common practice. So in 2008, a Bureau of Justice study showed that there were 216,000 prisoners raped that year, on average 3 to 5 times each. Now, to compare that, there were only 778,000 rapes in the rest of America. So there were nearly 3 times as many rapes in prison
as the entirety of the rest of America. That's a harrowing statistic. So that's obviously, if that happens to somebody, that's something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, and that's happening to people who are nonviolent drug offenders. That's terrible. Now, one of the big dangers of the drug war is also danger to property rights. So through something called asset forfeiture, the government can come in and take property away from people without ever charging or accusing them of a crime. So under civil asset forfeiture, which my colleague Audrey Spalding, sitting over there, and I have done a fair amount of research on at the Show Me Institute, the government can charge property with a crime as opposed to charging a person with a crime. Now, if you charge the property with a crime, it doesn't have a lot of those, due process rights that a person has. So your burden of proof is lowered. You only have to prove the case with a preponderance of the evidence instead of beyond a reasonable doubt. Also, there never has to be a charge against the person, so you can just show that it's more likely than not that this property was involved in a crime at some point. Also, there's no provision for counsel, so except in extreme cases. So the burden is on the defendant to go out, hire an attorney, and then pay for that attorney to get his property back. Now, if the police get, say, $500–600 from a person, and they have to go out and hire an attorney to get that money back, that's not going to be worth it to them. The attorney is going to eat up all that money, so you might as well just let the money go. And so the police can honestly just basically take the money away from people. And this is fairly common. In our research in Missouri, less than half, or a little less than half of the forfeiture cases in 2007 to 2009 did not result in any sort of criminal charge, or the defendant was found not guilty. So a lot of these cases, they're taking property away with no actual criminal charge and no conviction. Also, there's a process called equitable sharing. And this is what happens here is that a state or local law enforcement agency will team up with a federal law enforcement agency, say the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. And when the state agency seizes the property, the DEA gets 20% of the property, and the state agency will get the other 80%. And now, this is a federal law. Missouri state law says that all the money from asset forfeiture should go to a school fund so that it doesn't corrupt the process of law enforcement. But because federal law trumps that, the state law enforcement agencies can get money from this. And so this is also this is a violation of federalism. This is the federal government coming in and overriding state law. Now, the incentives that the police face are also perverted by this. So now, if you're a police department and you're patrolling a stretch of interstate highway, on one stretch, drugs are coming in, and on the other, money is going back out. Which one do you want to patrol if you can seize property?
Money.
Yeah, take the money, because you can keep the money. If you seize drugs, well, you can't sell those drugs. You're not going to get any money out of that. So there was recently a case around Nashville in Tennessee where a corridor of I-40 was being literally fought over by different law enforcement agencies. They'd run each other off the road trying to pull over tractor trailers. And when they would pull them over, they would get the money. The number of people pulled over going westbound, that is back to Mexico with the money, was twice that pulling over people going eastbound. Now, what this tells me is that the police don't even care about the drug war anymore. They're letting drugs in. I mean, that is the purpose of this, is to let the drugs in, let them be sold, and so they can get the money back. They've become just another group trying to get their cut out of the drug trade. And so this is another example would be Camp Zoe here in Missouri, which is a campground in central Missouri owned by a guy who fronts a Grateful Dead cover band. And so they would have concerts there every summer, and a lot of hippies would come out, and at times there were 10,000 people there on this property. And I'm sure that there was a fair amount of drug use going on, and undercover police came and bought drugs from these people. Now, they do not allege that the owner was involved in any of this at all, just that it was happening on the property. Now, The one thing that we do know, the one group of people that we know was allowing drugs to be sold, are the police, because they were there buying them and allowing it to be sold. Now perhaps if they had bought them and then arrested the people who sold them, you could say, well, they're doing something to fight the drugs. But in this case, they're just collecting the evidence so that they can forfeit the property. And that's what they're going through the process of right now. So this is a complete distortion of the incentives that the police face, so that they have no incentive to actually police drugs, just the drug money. Now, I think a lot of these outrages sort of have eroded the respect for law enforcement among a lot of groups of people. I think this is particularly true among the black community. And is anyone familiar with the Stop Snitching campaign? Anyone heard of that? Well, the basic idea is that don't ever cooperate with the police, ever, under no circumstances. Some of the people that have been spokesmen for this have said that, not even in a murder case should you ever cooperate with the police. And it's becoming a very adversarial thing among a lot of groups, that they see the police as the enemy. And once that happens, you basically, law and order is not going to go well if that's the attitude between police and the population. And I think that's true among a number of groups of people, but I think it's strongest in black and other minority communities. Now, I think the most distressing part of the drug war is the explosion in SWAT raids. These are now used quite commonly, not just in violent situations, and that's, the SWAT team has a valuable role to play when there is if a gunman is on the loose or if hostages have been taken. That is a vital and necessary function of the police. However, a lot of the SWAT teams are now just being used to serve search and arrest warrants. So this has led to a lot of unnecessary deaths. So back in November of 2006, police in Atlanta, who had received an anonymous tip, we did not, at the time it was, no one could find out who gave the tip, but that drugs were being sold out of an apartment, and they kick in the door. A 92-year-old woman who was living there did not know what was going on, responded, this is not a good neighborhood, responded quite naturally, I believe, by reaching for a small pistol and shooting at what she believed were intruders. One shot hits the door, this is a small pistol, it sticks in the door. The police respond with a volley of dozens and dozens of bullets, killing her dead. And while she lay there dying, the police, what we now know, is that the police were getting their stories straight and attempting to cover up what had just happened, because there were no drugs in the apartment. The informant had given them bad information, and the woman died. Several of these officers have now been convicted of manslaughter and higher charges. The woman's name was Catherine Johnston, if you're interested in looking that case up. Now, more locally, last year there was a raid on a guy named Jonathan Whitworth's home in Columbia, Missouri. Now, he did actually prove to have a small amount of marijuana and a grinder for grinding it up. They thought he might be a dealer. There was no evidence of that, though. But that did not stop them from kicking down his door, shooting both his dogs. One was a corgi. It was killed. Vicious corgis. Those are a real terror. And another one was hit by a ricocheting bullet. Now, that bullet his 7-year-old son was also present in the house. That ricocheting bullet could have just as easily lodged in his brain. If you're firing into a home and bullets are ricocheting around, there is no telling where those bullets are going to end up. Now, if you think I'm just cherry-picking examples, I'll give you two more from just the past couple weeks. So Corey May, who is, this is a case that's been ongoing, but this guy has been in prison in Mississippi, one of the worst prisons in the country, Parchman Penitentiary, and he was just released well, I think he's still awaiting release, but he has been, his sentence has been reduced to time served. But what had happened is, back in 2001, officers raided his home. He lived in a duplex. They did not realize it was a duplex. So the drug dealer who lived next to him, they were after him, and they did arrest him and found drugs. They never filed any charges, though, because of what happened at the other side of the duplex. They kick in his door, and he responded, again, I think quite naturally, thinking they were intruders, and as one of the officers came through the door, shot him, and it killed the man. And that's a terrible tragedy. That tragedy was then compounded as he was convicted for murder. That conviction has now been overturned and reduced to a manslaughter conviction. because the jury has now decided that it was a mistake, and so he's been it's been reduced. He's going to be let out of prison, but this is something that never should have happened in the first place. I encourage you to look up that story as well. He's largely free based on the work of a guy named Radley Balco. And if there's anything I can do today, I would encourage you all to read this man's work. I believe he's the most important journalist working today. He's named after Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird, so that's where that odd name comes from. But so I would encourage you to read his work, and he's done just tremendous things on this particular issue. Now finally, 3 weeks ago, a guy named William Cooper, who is a former NASA employee in Virginia, 69-year-old guy, cops break into his house. They believe that he is selling his prescription painkillers. According to his neighbors, he never had any visitors, so it's hard to see how he could have been selling it. But the thing is we'll never really know what was going on there. All the police found was a couple of empty painkiller bottles, which he was prescribed to, and so that's not a whole lot of evidence, but we're not going to actually have any trial or anything, because when the police raided the house, he came out with a handgun, he was shot dead. And so they'll never have to prove anything in court because that man's dead. They also are going to be able to get his property because they're taking it through asset forfeiture, and there's no one that will have standing to try to get that property back. Now, at the same time, when they raided this house, it was about noon, and there was a girls' softball game occurring about 200 feet away. The police were not aware that there was a softball game was going on, and they fired a number of rounds, and people that were at the game report those rounds whizzing around the field. And also a bullet was lodged in the neighbor's house after this happened. I could give you many more examples of this happening, but I'll just give you the larger picture numbers. Balco estimates that these raids occur between 100 and 150 times a day in this country. Now, that may actually understate the case, because in Maryland, this is the only state where the police are actually required to keep track of these raids and report them to a state agency. In Maryland, we now know that these raids occur about 4.5 times a day. And that translates, if we scale it up to the entire United States by population, there's a lot of problems with that, but this is the best numbers we have to go on. That would equal 225 times a day across the United States. And 94% of these raids are used to serve search and arrest warrants. So this is not there's a gunman holed up in the basement kind of situation, which I think SWAT is perfectly justified in. You're justified in using it in those situations. This is we need to search your house. I don't think that warrants, in most cases, busting down the door with a battering ram and coming in guns blazing, throwing a flashbang in there. And this law in Maryland was actually passed because the police raided the home of the mayor of Berwyn Heights, Maryland, and what had happened is someone was trying to ship weed through the mail, and it was addressed to his home, and it actually got sent there. They never opened the package, but the police tracked that package, and it was determined that he had nothing to do with it. But they busted down his door and shot both of his dogs in the process. The shooting of the dogs is very, very common in these raids. It's so common that Balco has come up with a term for it, calls it puppycide. And it happens, it's almost, just de rigueur. It happens in almost every case. Now, so this is all going on. What are the results of the drug war? Perhaps if there were some decent results, we might say that this is all worth it. Well, I don't think so. Drugs are actually more potent because of the drug war. There's something in economics called the Alchin-Allen theorem, which says that if your fixed costs of something, say like the cost of transport, or in the case of drugs, the risk premium that you have to pay someone to handle drugs, if that goes up, then you're going to increase the quality of the good that you're transporting. And so in the case of drugs, what you do is you increase the quality of it, or the potency of it. So instead of, in the Andes Mountains, let's go back historically. During Prohibition, people didn't really drink beer. They drank bathtub gin and moonshine because that was strong. It was easier to hide. It was easier to transport. So in the case now, instead of, in the Andes Mountains, they chew on coca leaves. Well, in the United States, people smoke crack. Instead of, at the turn of the century, people used to take a lot of a lot of tinctures that contained opiates like laudanum. Well, now instead people shoot heroin, and instead of milder stimulants like benzodrine, which was popular back in the 50s, people now cook up methamphetamine and often burn down their homes in the process. I'm from Poplar Bluff, Missouri, which for many years was known as the meth capital of the world, so I can speak with great experience on that. It's awful, and it's...
Would you take a couple questions, John?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Do I have just like 2 minutes to finish up? All right. Also... But so the main point is that drug prohibition does not actually seem to deter much use. There's some evidence that it decreases. Some people are discouraged from using drugs, but not that many people. And it's usually the marginal users, the people who don't have that. They're not the addicts. Those are the people that they're not going to be discouraged by any law. Just 1 second. I'm almost done. So in Portugal, 10 years ago in Portugal, they decriminalized drugs totally. This isn't total legalization, but it's a lot closer than what we have. And the number of problematic drug users that they have has fallen by half, from 100,000 to just over 40,000. According to Portugal's drug czar, the new policy has led to, quote, spectacular reduction in the number of infections among intravenous users and a significant drop in drug-related crimes. So I don't think that the drug war is actually producing any kind of acceptable results. It's counterproductive. And so after 40 years of abject failure, I think it's past time that we put an end to such an irrational policy. Thank you.
I have a question, not about drug sellers, about drug users. What is the action of the people who use drugs? What do they do? In other words, what are their actions for the average drug user? What do they do something? What's their action?
Well, I think it's fairly normal, actually. I mean, there are obviously cases where they do some crazy things, but those are by far the exception rather than the rule. I mean, there are over 50 million Americans in this country who have at least at one time smoked marijuana. And most of the time, at least especially with marijuana, all they probably did was sit around and watch television and laugh at things that weren't actually funny and probably eat too much. But in most cases, there's not, there isn't a dramatic change in behavior. Most people just hang out and do a whole lot of nothing. But there are exceptional cases. I would say, possibly the drug users whose behavior becomes most affected would be meth users after a number of days. That's more from a lack of sleep and borderline psychosis at that point. But those are the only ones that I would really consider dangerous. Yeah.
Okay, so my question has to do with in the country where it was legalized. Is there still a smaller black market for the drugs, or is it that it's just like going to the store and buying drugs? I mean, where do you go to buy the drugs, and how do you prevent smaller children and people who shouldn't have the ability to make that decision for themselves from taking the drugs? I'm not really understanding how it's legalized and then it becomes such a better thing as opposed to.
Well, in Portugal, like I said, it's not full legalization, but so yes, there is still a black market, and this is why I think that full legalization actually has to be the solution. But so if you get caught with drugs in Portugal, they're not going to send you to prison at all. And in fact, unless they decide that you're an addict, they're not going to do anything to you if it's just possession. Now, if you're an addict, they'll make you go to treatment. But now, if you're selling drugs, you can still there's still penalties for that. And so I think actually it would be better if you could bring it into a more legalized and regulated market, because then you could actually have legal standards for what this is the quality the quality of the drug must meet. This is the purity standards, and that way people would actually know what sort of drugs they're getting. A lot of people now under our current laws die from heroin overdoses, for instance, because they don't know the quality of the heroin. So they'll get what's called a hot shot, which is heroin that's of much greater quality than they thought, and so they'll inject it and they'll overdose and they'll die. But so if it were a regulated standard, you could say, well, this is it wouldn't be that much different from most prescription painkillers. You can say, this is exactly this much, this is how much this person generally takes, and it would cut down on the number of deaths. Also, I think under a legalized scenario is the only one where you can totally get rid of black market violence, where people are out there fighting over territory. So I think that's another key element of it.
Which removes then the stigma for the snitching and all of that. Because I think what you said about the snitching in the black community, it's not that they don't want to cooperate with the police, it's that if you're poor and you're in a bad neighborhood and you see the police only coming in to seize assets and money from the drug war and not preventing the drugs, then why should you trust them? I mean, it's really quite logical, and it does explain a lot for that, for what you said.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, it's not that they don't want the police to help them, it's that they are afraid of...
they're going to help them.
Right. Yeah.
So are you advocating that all drugs be legal? Is there any drug that would be so potent or so dangerous that you said it should be illegal?
I mean, this is getting philosophical, but I think that I suppose that if there were some sort of hypothetical drug that actually, you know, like if this is going to be a weird analogy, but you're familiar with Star Trek and the Borg?
Yeah.
All right, if there was a drug that assimilated you into the Borg, which is actually in like old kids' cartoons, is sort of actually what drugs did, at least from when I was growing up. But you know, if you had a drug that assimilated you into the Borg and turned you evil automatically, I suppose that should be illegal.
Doesn't methamphetamine come pretty close to that?
I don't think so. I mean, trust me, there are a lot of really crazy meth users, but I grew up in a place where lots and lots of people use meth. You'd be surprised who's using it. A lot of the people are very normal. They're lawyers, they're doctors. They don't advertise that, but you know, people knew. And so there are, however, a lot of crazies. Don't get me wrong, but most of the people that use it do not actually have a problem with it. They probably shouldn't use it, but you know, lots of people shouldn't drink as much as they do. Lots of people, people shouldn't smoke cigarettes.
And even if they do have, bizarre criminal behavior, that behavior in and of itself would be criminal for the consequence of it, regardless of whether they were on drugs or not.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think this is another important issue. You know, I'm certainly not advocating that, if a drug addict does something, then he should be viewed as a victim of his habit or something. No, I mean, if you do something because you're messed up on drugs, then you're fully responsible for your actions, and you should be punished for that crime. So if you rob somebody while high on drugs, convict him for the robbery. Absolutely.
I'm not wanting to.
Ruthie wanted to ask a
I'm
question.
sorry, go ahead.
There are people that wanted to ask questions.
Just saying that historically, maybe not now, but historically our country's been very wealthy, so we can afford to incarcerate people. But in poorer countries, they only incarcerate wealthy people in those countries or Americans that are visiting, but everybody else they just round up and kill. So they don't worry about incarcerating people that are violating drug issues. The other thing, in the opium wars, remember the opium wars you heard about in China? It wasn't really a war. That was just where about 25% of the population was addicted to opium. It was such a drag on their population. When you have someone who's an addict, they can't function, and their relatives don't take care of them. It was decimating their world. So they just rounded up all the people and killed them all, 1/4 of their population. So I guess
that's not what happened in the opium wars.
I guess my question is, what would our society look like if we had a bunch of addicts running around?
Well, I mean, it would.
If it was legal.
I mean, it would look about what it looks like today. I mean, we have a bunch of addicts running around right now. I mean, there's a few million past month drug users. There's probably a few million addicts in this country right now. And also, I mean, we have lots of addicts of lots of different substances that are perfectly functional in society. There are many, many elderly people that are addicted to painkillers that are functionally no different than heroin. They just don't shoot them up, and they don't, they don't abuse them in the way that they're not using them to get high, they're using them to treat their pain, but they're addicted. I mean, if you took that drug away from them, they would go through withdrawals and they would crave it substantially. So anyone that's on, Oxycontin, hydrocodone, Vicodin, all those things are massively addictive and functionally not that different from heroin. And so, we have that situation now. There's millions of people that are addicted to cigarettes, and it's bad for them, no doubt. But it's not, it's not bad for society overall. The person bears the costs of their addiction, and they're still functional. You know, they can go around and they can work and live. Actually, one of the things that causes addicts in the of illegal drugs to be really unfunctional is the fact that they have to spend all their time chasing down the next high. So, you know, if you're looking for, if you have to score heroin every 4 hours, if you, you have to constantly be on the phone with people trying to get it, trying to wrangle up the money to get it because you can't keep a job because you're constantly seeking out heroin. Whereas if you had a legal supply of it, you could actually, know where, when you're getting it and not spend all your time trying to make connections to do all that.
John, would you do our wonderful game of skill?
Yep.
You can make the invisible hand visible and pick the winning ticket for half a lunch.
All right.
You can read the last 3 digits.
All right, it's 764.
Yeah. Oh, no.
All
right.
right.
Mr. Reg,
The winner, huh?
way to go from the round table. Excellent.
We should have given out drugs today.
I
want to remind everyone that this talk was informational only, and unfortunately, I don't have statistics on alcohol is legal, as is gambling now, and the problems from both of those is unbelievable. This was informational only. Pachyderm does not support this, nor does the Republican Party.
That's why we have these open great discussions.
I know that, but I think there may be some people that think this is an advantage.
John, will you stick around for a few minutes to answer any remaining questions?
Oh, certainly. I'd also like to eat my lunch.
Please eat your lunch.
Next week, great job.
I do have the new State House map that was turned in last Tuesday from Missouri State Republicans, so compare it with the current map and